Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish. So we are at week 7 of English 122, and this week is pretty quiet. We're going to go over some chapters of poetry, but so far I've been looking at your thesis statements for your poetry papers, and so far nearly everybody is right on the mark, like all set to go, including I'm recording this Sunday night, so some of you haven't submitted your thesis statements yet. Make sure that you do so, but you all will get feedback from me. So if you look on your Falcon Mail, you should see an email where I'm giving you feedback on what I think of your topic. But the ones I've read so far look like they're going to make great poetry papers. Some of you have asked some questions, and I included my answers on those. If you have any questions during the writing process, just make sure to get back to me and let me know what those are as well. But overall, really excited by what you guys are planning to write about. So want to talk this week about the assignments. So I'm going to go to course content on here. There's actually only 2 assignments this week, so take a breather as we get closer to midterm. The only 2 assignments this week, we're going to go over chapters 13, 14, and 15 in your textbook. So there are quite a few chapters. You have the week 7 discussion forum and your outline. So the outline for paper 2. I've had a few students ask about this. Really what I'm looking for is for you to explain to me how you're going to structure your poetry paper. Obviously, it's a little bit different than your fiction or prose paper because you don't have as many details probably worked out. But for example, let me just pull up a Word document here and kind of show you what I'm looking for. So in terms of what your outline should look like, it can be very, very simple. So let's just say that I'm going to have, if I chose to do my own poems based on my images, I might do, if I did option, we have option number 1 versus option number 2. Okay, so if I chose option 1, which would be analyzing either 2 songs or 2 poems, here could be a sample outline. So I'd have my introduction, and then I would have point 1, I would compare and contrast the 2 poems pattern. Point 2, I could say I'm going to compare and contrast the 2 poems. I'm going to include my apostrophe there. Imagery. And then point 3, I can say I'm going to compare and contrast the 2. I'm going to add in another term just for good measure. 2 poems, rhyme scheme. All right, and then point 4, I'm going to tell which poem I liked best and why. And then point 5 is going to be the poem I create, and then my conclusion. That's a pretty standard format for option 1. Obviously, the terms here, you don't have to do pattern imagery or rhyme scheme. You get to pick which terms you look at, but the outline should be pretty basic like that. If I chose option 2, the typical outline that I've seen students use over the past few semesters has been poem number 1, an image, and then poem number 2, an image. And then for the analysis introduction, I could say point 1, I could say why I chose these images. That could be a point. Point 2, I could say the term, one of the terms I used, I could say tone and pattern in each poem. And then I could say point 3, imagery in each poem. And then I could say point 4, which I like best and why, and then my conclusion. So, and you can add as many points as you want. Your paper could have 20 points. It could have, typically you need at least 2 or 3 points to make that full, page length requirement, but you can have as many points as you want. You can talk about as many terms as you want. And I also want to stress, these outlines are not set in stone. I am not making you sign in blood. This is going to be my end-all be-all outline. It's just an outline to get you started. It's just an outline to show me that you understand the assignment and that you have enough terms and enough content to make the requirements. That's all it is, really. That's pretty much all I'm looking for in terms of the outline for this assignment for this week. So, yeah, that is pretty much the outline assignment. Nope. And then, like I said, we're going to go over chapters 13, 14, and 15, but you have discussion forum for week 7, and I'll pull it up real quick right before we go over the chapters. Pull up that discussion forum. So week 7, we are basically, you're picking a poem from pages 715 to 730. And then you're answering the questions about those poems. So does your poem have a pattern? Is it open form? Is it free form? Free verse? How do you know? What is a metaphor or simile that's in your poem? Explain that. And then you take one of the terms from chapter 15, not metaphor, simile, and apply it to the poem and explain your answer. So what I want in this discussion forum is to see that you can pick a poem and analyze it and do like a little micro-analysis in this discussion forum of it. Because that's, if you can do it in this discussion forum, you can do it in your paper. So that's kind of the rationale behind this week's discussion forum. So should be pretty easy, right? You all, for week 6 discussion forum, you all chose some fantastic poems to compare and contrast. I really thought some of you were really creative. I like that some of you chose similar poems, and you guys commented in the responses. You're like, hey, I picked that poem, and I thought the same thing. You all did really, really well in the discussion forum for this last week. So I'm excited to see what you pick for this forum, and then kind of analyzing your decisions and your choices made on that. So that's my hope, is that we get some good conversations about poetry from the discussion posts. And this last week we have. So y'all hit the mark right there. So in our resources, going down to week 6 and week 7, we have our poetry presentation. We started this last week. We're going to finish it. We're on slide 8. So slides 1 through 7, we're all dealing with the preview chapter for poetry. And now these are dealing with the last 3 chapters. You're going to notice in chapters 13, 14, and 15, there's not a lot of terminology. So the discussion forum is going to be a little bit creative. For example, this is all that we have on chapter 13. We have chapter 13, this in the next slide. We get context, which is a web of meanings, the meanings behind poetry. Very similar to prose, poems ask the audience to do things. So our textbook points out that poems ask questions. They work out answers. They play off of opposites and polarities. They try to use compare and contrast a lot of times to draw these vivid images for us and to help explain how things are constructed. They play off points of view. So poems can be from different perspectives. And much like a prose story, poems often build to a climax. Now, obviously, a poem doesn't have all that rising action and build up like a story does, but it does sometimes lead to a very poignant part to it that is meant to elicit an emotional response from the reader. So chapter 13 talks about that, looking at the whole poem, but they also give us some other terminology. Now, concrete poetry, if you remember concrete and abstract from the prose section, concrete poetry is exactly that. It's just talking about tangible things. The use of repetition and parallelism is pretty common in poetry. Repetition is just repeating similar styles, patterns, things in a poem. And then parallelism is when your poem starts and ends in a similar way with similar text. So sometimes a poem will start with a line and it will end with that exact same line. That's parallelism. Cumulative and counterpoint. A cumulative is when things pile up in a poem. The verses all keep amounting to a certain moment. It's kind of like prose where you're building to that climax. In cumulative poems, the text is building to a certain point. In counterpoint, though, you're just bouncing from one idea to the next. It's just like a pinball machine. You're just bouncing back and forth. It doesn't really build to anything. It's just bouncing off of ideas. So, and a counterpoint poem might be like something talking about the seasons, just bounces from one season to the next. Whereas a cumulative poem might talk about like someone's age, like you're accumulating years. Whereas with counterpoint, you're just bouncing back and forth between different elements. Antithesis, or some people say antithesis. Antithesis is when you take a theme and you build a poem whose purpose is the opposite of it. So if you take the theme of hope, if your poem is the antithesis of hope, it's a poem about despair. So you're just creating a poem that's the opposite of a certain trope or theme. That's antithesis. And then if something is metaphysical, the word meta kind of annoys me because I think people just toss it around. They don't really know what it means. But metaphysical is all about rationalizing and analyzing emotions. So it's beyond what's physically there. It's passion, it's sorrow, it's examining emotions and how they play in a poem. So it's the opposite of concrete poetry. It's very abstract if you're dealing with the metaphysical. And then chapters 14 and 15, you probably will notice that there's not a lot of terminology. Chapter 14 doesn't really have any terms in it at all. Chapter 14 just has those really cool glossy pages on page 698, which there's 3 sections of glossy pages in our textbook. Those are all like poem and image combinations. They're really cool. I definitely look on page 698 at that first set, and you can see those poem and image combos there. They're really neat. Chapter 15 talks about metaphor versus simile again, which I think everybody did great on the metaphor question in the prose section of our exam. Be careful of cliches, especially in poetry. I know everybody jokes, they're like, roses are red, violets are blue, and they make like a meme out of it. Yeah, that's cliche. So you want to kind of avoid that because you want poetry to be sincere. And if you're relying on a cliche, it's going to come across as the opposite of that. It'll seem tired and overdone. An extended metaphor is a metaphor that's repeated throughout the poem, and a controlling metaphor is when that extended metaphor becomes the central theme and the driving force behind the poem. So if this metaphor of a butterfly is repeated throughout the poem, and suddenly the poem becomes about the butterfly, that's a controlling metaphor. The metaphor has become an integral part of the poem. Figurative language is just something that's not real. We talked about figurative with prose. It's just something that's an exaggeration or it's not really there. It's just kind of meant to represent something. Sonnets and conceits. The last 2 terms on here, I had one semester where I had several high school students in my class, and they all lamented that they spent way too much time in high school writing sonnets. I had one girl in my class go, I wrote probably a dozen sonnets my senior year, and I'm like, why did that teacher make you suffer? Sonnets are a very specific 14-line poem that has a very specific pattern and structure. William Shakespeare, because we all know Shakespeare had to show off. He loved to write sonnets. So our textbook actually has a lot of examples of sonnets, and a lot of them are written by Shakespeare. So at some point I'm going to ask you, maybe in your exam, who knows, to give me an example of a sonnet and explain what it is. And your textbook talks a little bit about what sonnet is, but it has to be a 14-line poem that has a specific structure and rhyme scheme to it. So I'm not going to make you write any sonnets because that would be torture, but several of my past students have said, oh, we know what that is. So maybe you do as well. Maybe you wrote sonnets in high school. I don't know. My high school English teachers did not have us write a lot of poetry, so I did not exactly, I think maybe I wrote one sonnet in high school and that was about it. A conceit is an elaborately developed poem similar to a sonnet, but it sets up analogies, so it sets up stories in a poem. So it's just an elaborate poem that tells stories. Kind of like a prose in a way, but obviously it's dealing more with the language, with the rhyme, with the pattern, the tone. It's more intricate in its mechanics than just a prose story. But those are the terms for chapters 14 and 15 and 13. So nothing crazy this week. I have opened up the other weeks so you can work ahead if you want to. Next Sunday I'll talk about week 8. We're getting closer to midterm. But in the meantime, I'm excited to see your outlines and your discussion forums this week. I should have your papers great. Your papers are all graded by now and back to you from paper 1, so you can revise those if you choose to. You don't have to. It's totally optional. But if you have any questions at all about paper 2, if you have, paper 2 is usually the paper that students are like, this is new, this is different. You do get a chance to revise it if you turn it in on time, but if you have any questions as you're writing your paper, please let me know. Just feel free to shoot me an email, say, hey, Miss Parish, does this look fine? And I will be happy to let you know. So, as always, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Stay safe, and I'll talk to you all again soon.